Okay, so today we are talking about neuroscience and communication within the nerve system. So people who study the connection between the brain and the nervous system and the various aspects of the human experience are called neuropsychologists. And they look at the biological foundations of things like consciousness, perception, memory, emotion, stress, and mental disorders. Communication within the nervous system takes place at the nerve cell level, and these specific nerve cells are called neurons. And neurons communicate to, from, and within the central nervous system. Now remember that the central nervous system is made up of the brain and the spinal cord. These neurons then form the building blocks of the nervous system. So communication in the nervous system happens at the neuron level. So the neuron then has several different components. So first, let's talk about the dendrites. So the dendrites are these, basically you can think of them as like tree branches that are reaching out from our first neuron here. They receive information from other neurons and transmit it to the cell body. The cell body, the center of the neuron, this is where all of the maintenance takes place in order to keep this particular neuron alive. It also determines whether the neuron will fire. So that means that the cell body determines if the message that was received by the dendrites will then be sent onto the next neuron. So that's if a neuron will fire, if it's going to send the message. This axon here, this is the extending fiber that moves away from the cell body here, and the axon then conducts the impulse away from the cell body and transmits it to other cells. So the message then, as it's firing, is being sent down the axon. The axon, you will notice, is covered in these different coatings here, and this coating is called the myelin sheath. The myelin sheath is a fatty insulation that surrounds the axon, and the purpose of the myelin sheath is to speed up how quickly that message is sent from one neuron to the next. So it speeds up neural conduction. You have your action potential that is pushing this message down the axon, gets to the end here, and is converted into the release of chemical messengers. So this space here, this is the space between these two neurons up here. Okay, so neurons are not connected to one another. There is a space between them that's called the synapse, and the neurotransmitters then are these specialized chemicals that the neuron releases to transmit the message from the first neuron, so here's your first neuron, to your second neuron here. And these neurotransmitters then are those chemical messengers that allow for communication from one neuron onto the next neuron. So this is basically how neurons communicate then. The axon terminals release this neurotransmitter, right? This neurotransmitter enters the space or the synapse, the space between two neurons, and then the neurotransmitters bind to what are called receptor sites. So these are the receptor sites on the receiving neuron here. And so different neurotransmitters, which we'll talk about here in just a second, are specialized. They bind only to specific receptor sites. It's kind of like a lock and key analogy, that certain neurotransmitters will only fit with specific receptor sites. So there are several different classes of neurotransmitters. Remember, neurotransmitters are those chemical messengers, and we have several different examples. So we have serotonin as a neurotransmitter, and serotonin is involved in the regulation of mood, of your sleep-wake cycle, of appetite, and of pain suppression. So specific drugs that are antidepressants work directly on serotonin to change the mood of individuals who suffer from depression. Dopamine is involved in learning, reward, and voluntary movement. So dopamine then we see is one of the principal neurotransmitters that is involved in the pleasurable effects that you get from using drugs that produces that extreme euphoria that's caused by the release of dopamine. Acetylcholine, involved in muscle action or memory, particularly with individuals who have Alzheimer's disease. Norepinephrine, involved in increased heart rate. And endorphins, these are endogenous chemicals that your body produces, and they are involved in the reduction of pain and the promotion of pleasure.